power, wealth, legacy, and the curse that destroyed it all. This is the story of how America's richest family, the Vanderbilts, rose to unimaginable glory, only to lose everything within a century. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Now, let's step back into the Gilded Age, where fortunes were forged in iron and destinies were broken by pride. The wind that came off the Narrows carried the scent of salt and coal smoke, mingling with the cries of gulls and the faint clang of ship bells from the harbor. Staten Island, in those years at the dawn of the 19th century, was a world of mud roads and hard hands, a place where ambition had to be carved from the sinew of labor and the stubbornness of will. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born there in 1794, the fourth of 9 children to a family that owned little but the patch of earth under their boots and the boat his father used to ferry passengers across the waters to Manhattan. The boy was strong and taciturn, with eyes the color of the Hudson under rain. From the beginning, he was drawn to water, the pulse of commerce, the artery of opportunity. At 11, Cornelius dropped out of school. "What good are letters to a man who can read the tides?" he once told his mother. His father's small ferry was both his education and his inheritance. He learned how to navigate fog and current, how to read the moods of men waiting on the shore. By 16, he had saved enough from odd jobs and wages to buy a small periauga, a 2-masted sailing vessel with a flat bottom perfect for the harbor's shallows. He painted it white and named it Swiftsir. With Swiftsir, the young Vanderbilt began ferrying goods and passengers between Staten Island and Manhattan, his rates lower than any competitor. He rowed himself when he had to, undercutting everyone, his hands blistered but his eyes sharp with calculation. People laughed at him. The boy boatman, they called him, but by 21 he had made his first $1,000. That 1,000 was a seed, and Cornelius Vanderbilt was not a man to let a seed go unplanted. In 1817, steamboats began to prowl the waters of New York, loud, ungainly beasts of iron and flame. Where others saw risk, Vanderbilt saw power. He went to work for Thomas Gibbons, a sharp-minded entrepreneur who ran steamboats between New Jersey and New York in defiance of the state monopoly held by Robert Livingston and Robert Fulton. Gibbons was fighting a war in court. Vanderbilt fought it on the water. He learned everything: machinery, routes, pricing, the psychology of passengers. When Gibbons died, Vanderbilt had already planned his escape. He started his own line of steamships, slashing fares so low that competitors either sold out or went bankrupt. He moved like a storm across the Hudson, then the Sound, then down the coast, each victory measured not in money, but in submission. They began calling him the Commodore. He built his empire not by inheritance or favor, but by the ruthless precision of competition. His ships ran faster, cheaper, and more reliably than any others. When the California Gold Rush erupted in 1849, Vanderbilt saw an opening. He established a route from New York to San Francisco, not through the deadly Isthmus of Panama, but through Nicaragua, using riverboats and ocean steamers in a continuous chain. It was faster and safer, and it made him millions. He was no gentleman of the old world. He had little use for refinement. He swore like a sailor, dressed plainly, and despised charity. He distrusted bankers and lawyers, calling them leeches. His empire was built not in the salons of Manhattan, but in the engine rooms of his ships, in the smoke and steam and salt. By the 1850s, Cornelius Vanderbilt was one of the richest men in America. Yet he was restless. Steamships, he decided, were the past. The iron rails were the future. When he turned his eyes toward the railroads, the same pattern repeated. He bought, crushed, and absorbed. The Harlem Railroad, the Hudson River Railroad, the New York Central, all fell into his control. In 1869, he merged them into a single juggernaut, the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad. From his office on Wall Street, Vanderbilt looked over maps of the Northeast, tracing the lines that connected New York to Chicago. "This," he said to one of his sons, "is the new sea." But though he commanded rails and fortunes, Vanderbilt's own family was a tangle of rivalries and disappointments. His wife, Sophia, had borne him 13 children, though only 11 survived to adulthood. He loved none as he loved money. When Sophia died, he remarried, a distant cousin named Frank Armstrong Crawford, young enough to be his daughter. The family loathed her. In his later years, the Commodore grew colder, his humor dark, his generosity non-existent. He distrusted most of his children, considering them weak or wasteful. Only one, William Henry Vanderbilt, had earned his respect. William had proven himself capable, managing his father's railroad interests with competence and restraint. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877 at the age of 82, he left behind an empire worth more than $100 million, the largest personal fortune in American history at the time. More than that, he left behind a dynasty. At his funeral, the carriages of the nation's elite lined the streets. Men who had once cursed his name now bowed their heads. In the Vanderbilt vault on Staten Island, the Commodore was laid to rest beneath a marble slab that bore no flourish, only his name and the years of his life. But as the last spade of earth was pressed over his grave, a question hovered like a shadow over the gathered mourners. Would the fortune he had built endure? Or had he created an empire too vast, too brittle, a house of iron that would, in time, rust from within? The answer would unfold not in years, but in generations. When the Commodore died in 1877, the storm he left behind was not one of mourning but of inheritance. His will, written in a trembling but merciless hand, divided his empire with the precision of a general distributing spoils after war. The bulk of the fortune, some $95 million, went to a single man, William Henry Vanderbilt, his eldest surviving son. The others, 9 brothers and sisters, received sums that, while immense by ordinary standards, seemed pitiful beside their brother's inheritance. $10 million for Cornelius Jeremiah, $2 million here or there for the rest. But the Commodore had made his opinion plain. Any fool can make money. It takes a man to keep it. In the vast marble halls of the Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue, the air that winter of 1877 crackled with resentment. Servants whispered of the meetings between siblings behind locked doors, of the sharp glances cast toward William. He was called the luckiest man alive by newspapers, but luck had little to do with it. William Henry Vanderbilt had spent decades under his father's iron shadow. Where the Commodore was loud and cruel, William was quiet, cautious, a man of patience and calculation. For years he had been mocked by his father as Billy the Blatherskite, dismissed as weak and soft. But when the Commodore finally entrusted him with the management of the Harlem Railroad, William turned that jeer into triumph. He doubled profits, streamlined routes, and silenced the family doubters. Now, as the new patriarch, he inherited not just an empire, but the burden of proving he could hold it. The year 1878 dawned cold and hard over Manhattan. Wall Street was restless. America itself was restless. The panic of 1873 had left scars still visible: empty factories, broken banks, men adrift in the streets seeking work. But the Vanderbilts' wealth seemed immune to such tremors. William moved quickly. He consolidated his father's railroad holdings, restructured debts, and expanded westward. The New York Central became more than a railroad. It became an artery of the nation's growth, the steel backbone of a country newly obsessed with progress. Yet William had little of his father's appetite for public conflict. He was a private man, uneasy with the glare of attention. He worked from dawn until midnight, ate simple meals, and preferred solitude to society. His children, however, were not so restrained. His sons, Cornelius II, William Kissam, Frederick, and George Washington Vanderbilt, grew up in an age of inheritance and ambition. They were born to privilege and raised in the belief that the Vanderbilt name was synonymous with power. The daughters, too, Margaret Louisa, Emily Thorne, Florence Adele, and others, were educated to marry not for love, but for position. William's wife, Maria Louisa Kissam Vanderbilt, understood this better than anyone. A woman of quiet dignity and formidable will, she orchestrated her family's entrance into New York high society with the precision of a strategist. The old money families, the Astors, the Livingstons, the Schuylers, looked down on the Vanderbilts as new money, rough and unrefined. But Maria intended to change that. It was Alva Erskine Smith, the formidable wife of William Kissam Vanderbilt, who would finally breach the gates of New York society. In 1883, she conceived an event so extravagant, so dazzling, that it would make the Vanderbilts undeniable. The Vanderbilt Costume Ball at 660 Fifth Avenue became legend. Invitations were coveted as though they were royal decrees. The mansion itself, a chateau of limestone and carved marble, glittered with thousands of gaslights. Alva wore a gown of silver and white satin. Her husband came as the Duke of Valois. There were princes, heiresses, magnates, and actors, all gathered beneath the Vanderbilt roof. When Mrs. Caroline Astor, the self-proclaimed queen of New York society, was pointedly left off the guest list, she took the insult to heart. She sent word to Alva, and an invitation soon arrived. The night the Astors crossed the Vanderbilt threshold, the old order fell, and the new rose in its place. The newspapers called it the ball that conquered New York. In a single night, the Vanderbilt name was sanctified, not merely as industrial royalty, but as the embodiment of America's new aristocracy. While his children basked in society's glow, William Henry Vanderbilt remained in the shadows of his own fortune. He seldom attended parties, preferring his study and the hum of railway reports. His correspondence was terse, his laughter rare. When asked by a reporter why he refused to expand passenger services despite public demand, he replied with brutal honesty, "The public be damned. I run my railroads for my stockholders." The quote was printed in every paper in America. Critics called him heartless, arrogant, the embodiment of greed. But to William, it was simple truth. Railroads were not charities. They were machines, like the engines that powered them, driven by profit and precision. Despite the controversy, the fortune grew. By the time of his death in 1885, William Henry Vanderbilt had doubled the family wealth to $200 million, making him the richest man in the world. But as he lay dying in his Fifth Avenue mansion, surrounded by the faint ticking of clocks and the muffled voices of his children, a shadow crossed his mind, a sense, perhaps, that the empire he had guarded with such care was already slipping beyond the grasp of prudence. He had raised a generation accustomed not to toil, but to luxury. His sons and daughters, heirs to a mountain of wealth, were already building palaces, commissioning paintings, collecting horses, and sailing to Europe for seasons of leisure. The Commodore had built an empire of iron. William had gilded it. The next generation would adorn it with marble, and in doing so, begin the slow decay that no fortune, however vast, could withstand. As the great bells of St. Bartholomew's tolled the hour of his death, the city outside glittered with electric lights, the hum of progress filling the air. But within the Vanderbilt mansion, the empire's foundation began to tremble, not from lack of wealth, but from excess of it. The dynasty had entered its golden age, and every golden age, history would soon remind them, is also the beginning of decline. The death of William Henry Vanderbilt left the family empire divided among 8 heirs, but power, real power, fell to his 2 eldest sons, Cornelius II and William Kissam Vanderbilt. The age they inherited was one of marble facades and restless ambition. The railroads still ruled America, but the Vanderbilts were no longer content with tracks and tariffs. They sought beauty, legitimacy, immortality. Cornelius, too, solemn, responsible, the mirror of his father's discipline, took command of the New York Central Railroad. He was the steady hand, the guardian of the empire's industrial core. Yet even he could not resist the seduction of grandeur. His Fifth Avenue mansion, a palatial chateau of French limestone, stretched an entire city block. Its halls were lined with tapestries, its staircases carved from Italian marble. His brother, William Kissam Vanderbilt, was the family's flamboyant counterpart. His wife, Alva, now famous after her conquest of New York society, pushed her husband toward ever greater displays of opulence. Their Newport estate, Marble House, rose from the Rhode Island cliffs like a temple to excess. $11 million of gold leaf, marble, and imported European art. It was Alva's declaration that the Vanderbilts were no longer upstarts. They were royalty of a new kind, American royalty. But beneath the glitter, cracks began to show. William Kissam tired of Alva's relentless ambition and her hunger for social dominance. Their marriage, once strategic, turned bitter. When she discovered his infidelity, she did the unthinkable. She divorced him. In 1895, the scandal rippled through every newspaper from New York to Paris. The Vanderbilt name, once a symbol of power, now carried whispers of disgrace. Alva swiftly remarried, to Oliver Belmont, heir to another fortune, and built yet another mansion, Belcourt Castle. She used her new wealth and status to champion women's suffrage, a cause the old Vanderbilts found unseemly. Meanwhile, Cornelius II's health declined. The weight of the empire and the ceaseless pressure of maintaining appearances ground him down. He died in 1899 at only 55, leaving behind a widow, Alice Claypool Vanderbilt, and a new generation of heirs too young to remember the Commodore's austerity or William Henry's restraint. In their place rose George Washington Vanderbilt II, the youngest of the late patriarch's sons, a dreamer. He withdrew from New York society and built Biltmore, a sprawling estate in the hills of North Carolina. 16,000 acres of forest and gardens, a mansion larger than any royal residence in Europe. It was beauty beyond reason, elegance beyond need, and cost beyond control. The Vanderbilts had crossed the line from empire builders to empire spenders. The railroads still brought in wealth, but their attention had shifted from industry to indulgence. They hosted masquerade balls for 400 guests, imported entire rooms from French chateaux, filled their stables with thoroughbreds and their galleries with Rembrandts. And while they built, the world changed. The century turned, and with it came new fortunes. Carnegies, Morgans, Rockefellers, men who built not mansions but monopolies. The Vanderbilts, heirs of the steam age, were becoming relics of the Gilded Age. The new century opened with light and motion, electric bulbs, automobiles, telephones, telegraphs. But in the marble mansions of the Vanderbilts, time seemed suspended in a gilded haze. The family's wealth was vast, but its unity had splintered. Each branch lived as though separate dynasties, competing not for power, but for spectacle. The Commodore's empire, once a single roaring machine of iron and steam, had fractured into social empires of fashion, art, and leisure. Cornelius II's widow, Alice Claypool Vanderbilt, became the quiet matriarch. Her Fifth Avenue mansion was still the grandest in New York, its ballroom a monument to vanished restraint. She dressed her daughters in Parisian gowns and taught them that wealth was a duty, not a privilege. But even she could not slow the tide of extravagance her sons embraced. Cornelius Neely Vanderbilt III, the eldest, married against his mother's wishes, a spirited young woman named Grace Wilson, daughter of a banker but not of the right lineage. The marriage scandalized society, and Alice, furious, cut him off entirely. Neely's inheritance vanished with a stroke of her pen. He joined the U.S. Army instead, trading marble for medals, dignity for independence. His brother, Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, inherited the lion's share of the fortune. Handsome, charming, and adored by the press, Alfred became the embodiment of Edwardian splendor. He bred racehorses, bought yachts, and moved between Newport, London, and Paris with the ease of a prince. Yet behind the glamour lay a pattern that would soon define his generation: wealth without purpose. He had no head for business, no hunger for expansion, only for elegance. The railroads, once the core of the family's power, were now managed by distant executives and burdened with new competition. The Vanderbilts, for the first time, were no longer builders. They were inheritors. In 1912, tragedy brushed close. Many Vanderbilts had booked passage on the Titanic, but by chance, none were aboard. The family breathed a sigh of relief, only to face fate 3 years later. In May 1915, Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt boarded the RMS Lusitania in New York, bound for Liverpool. Germany had warned that ships entering British waters would be attacked, but Alfred refused to cancel his plans. He was 37, newly remarried, and expecting a child. On May 7th, a German U-boat torpedoed the Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. The ship sank in 18 minutes. Alfred Vanderbilt was seen giving his life jacket to a young mother and her child, helping them into a lifeboat before disappearing beneath the waves. His body was never recovered. The newspapers called him a hero. His widow, Margaret, became an icon of grace in mourning. But for the Vanderbilt family, the loss was more than personal. It was symbolic. The Golden Age had died with him. As Europe descended into the Great War, the Vanderbilt mansions grew quieter. The grand balls ceased. The gaslights dimmed. Younger heirs joined the Red Cross, the Army, the Navy, seeking meaning beyond the corridors of inherited privilege. The world had changed, and with it, the meaning of wealth. Industry was no longer measured by railroads and ships, but by oil, steel, and electricity. The Vanderbilt fortune, tied to a fading empire of rails, began to stagnate. In the shadows of their marble halls, portraits of the Commodore and William Henry watched in silence as their descendants drifted further from the engines that had built their name. The marble gleamed still, but the cracks had begun to show. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in 1918, a new world emerged, restless, fast, and electric. Jazz echoed through the cities, women cut their hair and raised their hemlines, and fortunes shifted as easily as the stock tickers on Wall Street. For the Vanderbilts, the old order was fading into memory. The empire built on rails had become an inheritance scattered among dozens of heirs, each carving their share into smaller fragments. The Commodore's single, towering fortune had become a forest of branches, each weaker than the trunk that bore them. Alice Vanderbilt, now the aging matriarch, watched from the windows of her Fifth Avenue mansion as motor cars replaced carriages and skyscrapers rose where brownstones once stood. She clung to old rituals, the calling cards, the dances, the servants who knew their stations, but even her world was shrinking. Her surviving sons carried the family name in diverging directions. Cornelius III, long estranged, lived quietly with Grace Wilson, finding purpose in military service and engineering. He had renounced his inheritance, but not his dignity. Reginald Vanderbilt, the youngest and most charming, inherited millions, and spent them with breathtaking speed. Reginald lived as though time itself were for sale. Champagne breakfasts, polo matches, lavish parties that spilled from New York to Palm Beach. He married twice, the second time to Gloria Morgan, a glamorous young woman barely out of her teens. In 1924, they had a daughter, Gloria Vanderbilt. That same year, America was roaring. The Jazz Age had crowned its new aristocracy, not railroad tycoons, but film stars, financiers, and flappers. The Vanderbilts still held their estates, Marble House, the Breakers, Biltmore, but their presence had become more decorative than dominant. The new titans, Rockefeller, Ford, and Morgan, controlled the engines of the modern world. The Vanderbilts, in contrast, threw garden parties among ghosts. In 1925, Biltmore, George Washington Vanderbilt's colossal North Carolina estate, stood as a monument to both grandeur and folly. The house alone required a small army of servants, its maintenance costs devouring the income it was meant to symbolize. George's widow, Edith Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, fought to keep it alive, opening its lands to forestry and farming, but the age of great estates was ending. When the Commodore had built, America was young and raw. Now it was fast, speculative, and modern. The Vanderbilts had become symbols of what once was, a living exhibit of the Gilded Age in a nation that no longer revered it. Then came the crash. In October 1929, the stock market plummeted. Fortunes evaporated in days. The Vanderbilts, diversified across railroads and real estate, fared better than most, but not unscathed. The younger heirs, raised to spend rather than to build, found themselves ill-prepared for austerity. Trusts shrank. Estates went unsold. The upkeep of palaces became unbearable. Servants were dismissed, wings were shuttered, and for the first time in over a century, the Vanderbilt name began to carry not awe, but nostalgia. The family that had once symbolized the power of American wealth now stood as its cautionary tale. The Great Depression rolled across America like a cold fog, swallowing fortunes, cities, and dreams. On Wall Street, the ticker tape slowed, then stopped. Men who had once worn diamonds on their tie pins stood staring at the pavement, clutching worthless stock certificates. In the Vanderbilt houses, those sprawling palaces of marble and gilt, the silence grew deeper than it had ever been before. For more than a century, the family had been synonymous with power. But the crash of 1929 revealed that the foundation of their empire had long since hollowed. The railroads, the core of the Vanderbilt fortune, had entered decline. The younger heirs had turned from business to leisure, from strategy to spectacle. Their fortunes were not built by them. They were consumed by them. Cornelius Neely Vanderbilt III, the eldest surviving son of Cornelius II, was perhaps the last to understand the meaning of structure, of order. An engineer and soldier, he had spent much of his life estranged from his mother for marrying a woman she deemed unworthy. But time had softened him, and with it, the grandeur of his name. He lived quietly, managing what remained of his wealth with careful hands, watching as cousins and nephews slipped into ruin. In Newport, the summer palaces that had once defined American excess became empty shells. The Breakers, Marble House, Rough Point, all stood shuttered through the long winters, their chimneys cold, their ballrooms echoing. The gilded furniture gathered dust beneath white sheets, the scent of lavender and salt air fading from the curtains. Even the servants, once an army, were gone, sent away when their wages could no longer be met. Far to the south, in Asheville, North Carolina, the grandest Vanderbilt creation of all began to crumble under its own weight. Biltmore, the vast stone chateau built by George Washington Vanderbilt, had always been a dream too large to live. After George's death, his widow, Edith, struggled to maintain the estate. The staff alone numbered in the hundreds. The heating, the gardens, the endless acres of land demanded a fortune. To keep it alive, she did the unthinkable. She opened its doors to the public. Visitors came by the thousands, awed by the scale, unaware that what they admired was not triumph but surrender. And yet, amid this decline, there were still glittering moments of scandal and spectacle. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt, the youngest of William Kissam's sons, embodied the last flare of the Gilded Age spirit. Charming, reckless, and impossibly elegant, he seemed born for champagne mornings and midnight galas. But he was also born into a world that no longer rewarded men like him. He raced horses, gambled fortunes, and surrounded himself with dancers and dreamers. His wealth dwindled faster than anyone thought possible. In 1923, he married Gloria Morgan, a dark-eyed beauty from a family with European ties and endless ambition. The union produced one child, a daughter, Gloria Laura Vanderbilt. She was barely a year old when her father died suddenly in 1925, his body spent by indulgence and drink. He left behind debts, confusion, and a trust fund worth several $1 million, placed not in his widow's hands, but in the care of lawyers and guardians. The young widow fled to Europe with her baby and her twin sister, living in hotels and borrowed villas, surviving on charm and remnant prestige. The papers adored her. But whispers grew. Too many photographs, too many rumors, too much extravagance. When the Great Depression hit, her lifestyle drew the attention of Reginald's sister, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, sculptor, art patron, and the formidable founder of the Whitney Museum. Gertrude saw a different future for her niece. In 1934, she took the matter to court, igniting one of the most sensational custody battles in American history. For weeks, the world followed every accusation, every scandalous testimony. The young mother was painted as decadent, neglectful, even immoral. The aunt was presented as noble and selfless. And in the middle sat a small child with solemn eyes, too young to understand that her name was being fought over like a title. When the verdict came, it was final. Custody went to Gertrude Whitney. The child became the poor little rich girl, and the Vanderbilt family name was no longer a symbol of progress or pride. It was gossip, scandal, and ruin. While the newspapers feasted on the trial, the family's true empire collapsed quietly in the background. The Fifth Avenue mansions that once stood as monuments to success began to vanish. Cornelius house, an entire city block of marble and granite, was torn down in 1926, replaced by a department store. Olver's mansion followed, its grandeur erased without ceremony. Even Marble House, the triumph she had once built to spite New York society, went dark. The old families no longer cared for palaces. They wanted liquidity, not legacy. By the late 1930s, the Vanderbilt name had become a relic. The railroads were losing passengers to automobiles and planes. The New York Central, once the most profitable company in the nation, was now just another struggling corporation. The family's investments, fragmented across generations, no longer produced wealth. They merely preserved the illusion of it. Then came the war. When Europe ignited in 1939, the younger Vanderbilts joined the effort, not as financiers, but as soldiers, reporters, and volunteers. Cornelius Vanderbilt IV became a war correspondent, covering the advance of fascism across Europe. Others worked for the Red Cross or in government posts. The family that had once ruled industry now served it. World War II was both an ending and a reprieve. It leveled old hierarchies. In a world rebuilt by steel, oil, and atomic power, there was no place for a dynasty of railroads. By the time peace returned in 1945, the family's wealth had thinned to a fraction of what it had been. The Vanderbilt name survived, but its meaning had changed. After the war, the old mansions fell in rapid succession. The last of them on Fifth Avenue, a silent sentinel of the Gilded Age, was demolished in 1949. A newspaper printed a single photograph, marble columns collapsing beneath a wrecking ball. No one gathered to watch. No ceremony marked the end. In a few short generations, the empire had come full circle, from a boy ferrying passengers across the Hudson to a dynasty dismantled stone by stone. And yet, in portraits that still hung in dim corridors, in Biltmore, in museums, in the few estates that remained, Cornelius Vanderbilt's stern gaze seemed to linger. His empire was gone, his fortune scattered, but his legend endured. The dynasty had outlived its wealth, and in that endurance, perhaps, it had achieved something greater than money ever could. It had become myth. By mid-century, the Vanderbilt name belonged more to memory than to money. The railroads had merged, faltered, and fallen under the control of corporations that no Vanderbilt had ever met. Fifth Avenue, once lined with their mansions, was now an avenue of glass towers. The world had moved forward, and the family that had built its engines had been left standing in its shadow. Yet, from the ruins of the dynasty's grandeur, one last figure emerged, a child who had grown up in the glare of scandal and the long shadow of her name. Gloria Vanderbilt, the poor little rich girl of the 1930s, was now a young woman, and the press that had once pitied her now followed her as if she were a princess from some fallen empire. She had inherited both the fortune and the weight of its history. Raised by her aunt in wealth and isolation, she had learned to navigate society's treacherous waters early, how to smile through curiosity, how to disguise loneliness beneath poise. When she came of age, she stepped into the public eye with the effortless grace of someone born to it, but determined to define herself beyond it. The post-war years in America were years of reconstruction, but for the Vanderbilts, they were years of reinvention. Gloria refused to live as a relic of her family's past. She studied art in New York and Paris, mingling not with aristocrats, but with painters, writers, and actors. The press called her a modern Vanderbilt, but she resisted the title. Her mother had been exiled by scandal. Her father had died young. Her inheritance, once immense, had been trimmed by trusts, taxes, and legal fees. But what remained was freedom. Freedom from the suffocating expectations of her forebears. She married young, at 17, to Pat DiCicco, a Hollywood agent with charm and a violent temper. The marriage was brief and bruising. When it ended, she fled to California and then back to New York, chasing not wealth but meaning. She painted, designed, acted, lived restlessly. The 1950s brought a second marriage, to Leopold Stokowski, the celebrated conductor more than 40 years her senior. To society, it was a scandal. To her, a kind of escape. She bore him 2 sons and lived for a time in Europe, among musicians and artists, where the Vanderbilt name meant curiosity rather than power. In New York, her cousins and distant relations had faded into quiet obscurity. The remaining estates were being sold off to universities, preservation societies, or developers. Biltmore, once a symbol of unrestrained ambition, had become a tourist attraction, its grandeur preserved by ticket sales and the careful hand of descendants who saw no shame in making history public. The world that had once bowed to the Vanderbilts no longer remembered why it should. And yet, paradoxically, that forgetfulness freed them. By the 1960s, Gloria Vanderbilt had become something her ancestors could never have imagined, a working artist. She turned her designs into fabrics, her drawings into business ventures. She refused to simply inherit. She created. The public, captivated by her beauty and her resilience, followed every chapter of her transformation. New York itself had changed beyond recognition. The city of marble mansions and rail barons had become a city of glass towers, jazz clubs, and advertising empires. The Vanderbilts no longer ruled it, but one of them, at least, belonged to it. Her third marriage, to film director Sidney Lumet, placed her squarely in the creative heart of mid-century Manhattan. They lived modestly compared to her ancestors, an apartment instead of a palace, but with more vitality than any Vanderbilt mansion had ever known. In photographs from those years, Gloria's eyes carry a curious mixture of light and loss. She was the embodiment of her family's contradictions, the artist descended from engineers, the dreamer born of titans, the heiress who wanted to work. And as America entered the turbulent 1960s, with its protests, its art, its new definitions of freedom, the Vanderbilt name began to mean something new again. Not power, not money, not empire, but survival. By the time her marriage to Lumet ended, she had begun to imagine her own legacy, one that had nothing to do with railroads or mansions. She launched her own line of clothing and home designs, signed her paintings, and appeared in public not as a curiosity, but as a creator. The dynasty that had once conquered steel and steam had been reborn, quietly, through art and reinvention. And yet, in quiet moments, when she painted alone, or when she visited the ruins of the old houses, Gloria sometimes imagined the faces of those who came before her. The Commodore at his shipyard, William Henry at his desk, Alva in her ballroom, Alfred on the Lusitania. Their ghosts were never far. She carried them not as burdens, but as proof of endurance. From fortune to ruin, from scandal to art, from empire to self, the Vanderbilt name still lived. The 1970s dawned with the scent of smoke and steel in New York. The city was changing once more. Grittier, bolder, louder. The age of tycoons had given way to an age of artists and icons, and in that strange twilight, the name Vanderbilt flickered back to life, not through business empires or grand estates, but through one woman's fierce will to redefine what her inheritance meant. Gloria Vanderbilt was now in her 40s, a survivor of scandal, heartbreak, and reinvention. She had lived many lives, socialite, artist, mother, muse, but now she found herself on the brink of a new one, entrepreneur. The American fashion world was shifting, opening its doors to names that told stories. It was no longer enough to be beautiful or rich. One had to create something that could be worn, touched, lived in. And Gloria, who had once painted on canvas, turned her creativity to denim. It began almost by chance. Working with a small textile company, she lent her name, and her sensibility, to a line of designer jeans cut to flatter women in a way no denim ever had. The name stitched in gold across the back pocket, Gloria Vanderbilt, became an emblem of both luxury and liberation. They sold not because of nostalgia for her family's fortune, but because they embodied her resilience. They told a story. Within a year, sales exploded. By 1978, her jeans were in every department store in America. Women who had never known or cared who Cornelius Vanderbilt was wore her signature across their hips, unaware that it came from a dynasty that had once ruled railroads instead of runways. She was everywhere, on billboards, in interviews, in the glossy pages of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. The face that had once graced society pages now represented something altogether different, reinvention through creativity. For the first time in generations, the Vanderbilt name was associated not with loss, but with success. Yet, beneath the surface, the old shadows lingered. Gloria's personal life remained turbulent. Her fourth marriage, to writer Wyatt Emery Cooper, brought her a rare sense of peace. Wyatt was Southern-born, intelligent, kind, an anchor in a world of flashing cameras and fickle friends. Together they built a home filled not with servants and chandeliers, but with laughter and art. They had 2 sons, Carter and Anderson, boys who grew up not in mansions, but in a Manhattan apartment lined with books and sunlight. Gloria painted. Wyatt wrote screenplays and essays. For a time, the past seemed to loosen its grip. Then, in 1978, tragedy returned, as it always had for the Vanderbilts. Wyatt died suddenly during open-heart surgery, leaving Gloria a widow once more. She was 54, with 2 young sons and a mountain of memories. Loss had followed her like a companion all her life, but now it came with unbearable clarity. Yet even grief became a kind of creation for her. She poured it into her art, her designs, her writing. Her jeans empire grew, expanded into perfumes, home decor, and fashion lines. She became, in every sense, self-made. New York in the 1980s glittered with money again. Wall Street's frenzy, Studio 54's excess, the neon glow of an age drunk on itself. But Gloria lived differently. She had seen what wealth without purpose could do. Her apartments were beautiful but lived in, her walls covered in art, her tables cluttered with brushes and sketches. She understood that what her ancestors had tried to build with marble and steel could now be built with imagination. The city adored her for it. She was no longer the poor little rich girl, but a symbol of endurance, a woman who had turned one of the most famous fortunes in history into a life of her own design. Still, her relationship with her past never ended. Reporters never stopped asking about the mansions, the railroads, the family legacy. She always answered with grace, sometimes with a small smile, sometimes with melancholy. "The money is gone," she would say softly, "but the name remains. And I suppose that's a kind of inheritance, too." Her sons grew in that strange mixture of fame and normalcy. Carter was reflective, gentle, deeply intelligent. Anderson, curious and bright-eyed, often sat beside her as she painted, asking about colors and shapes, never about the ghosts in the portraits on the wall. In the photographs of the era, she looks luminous and fragile at once. Silver hair, wide eyes, the same defiant grace that carried her through decades of reinvention. Behind her, America itself was reinventing, shedding its old myths and building new ones. By the late 1980s, her empire began to falter. Licensing deals soured, partners betrayed her trust, and fortunes made in denim began to slip away in lawsuits and boardroom conflicts. She had seen it before, how easily wealth could vanish. But this time, she faced it differently. She didn't fight for the empire. She let it go. "I've lost money," she said once, "but never my spirit." She was right. She had already lived what every Vanderbilt before her had not: the fall, the rebuilding, and the peace that comes from accepting impermanence. The dynasty had begun with Cornelius Vanderbilt, ruthless, unrelenting, obsessed with power. A century later, it found its gentlest heir in a woman who understood the one truth he never did: that survival itself is the ultimate wealth. As the decade drew to a close, the world looked to the next generation. Gloria's sons were grown now, poised to make their own way. One would go on to seek meaning in stories, in truth, in the telling of the human struggle, the same way his mother had sought it in art. And in him, though neither of them knew it yet, the Vanderbilt legacy would find its final voice. Morning light spilled across the East River, soft and gold, as the skyline of New York remade itself once more. The towers rose higher, the glass shone brighter, but below that glittering facade, the stories of old families like the Vanderbilts had become whispers, names etched in plaques and history books rather than spoken in drawing rooms. In her 70s now, Gloria Vanderbilt lived surrounded not by servants or admirers, but by her paintings, her memories, and the two sons who had grown into men. The world no longer measured her by fortune. It measured her by endurance. She had outlived nearly everyone who had ever sought to define her, outlasted the gossip columns, the scandals, and the critics. But time, ever patient, had one more sorrow to deliver. In the summer of 1988, tragedy struck with a violence that shattered her quiet world. Her eldest son, Carter Cooper, just 23 years old, fell to his death from the balcony of their apartment. Gloria was there, close enough to call his name, too far to save him. The memory of that moment, the helplessness, the silence after, would haunt her for the rest of her life. No loss, not even the deaths that had followed her since childhood, compared to that. And yet, somehow, she lived on. She painted, she wrote, she spoke softly of grief as though it were another color on her palette, something that could not be avoided, only transformed. Her youngest son, Anderson, became her companion in that survival. He was different, driven, introspective, endlessly curious. Where others saw tragedy, he saw stories. He became a journalist, chasing truth into the corners of the world, covering wars, disasters, revolutions. While the Vanderbilt name had once ruled the nation's rails, Anderson rode the airwaves, carrying not cargo or coal, but human voices, stories of loss, courage, and hope. Gloria watched him with pride, but also with the wary love of someone who had lost too much already. The world saw Anderson Cooper, the poised, silver-haired anchor. She saw her boy, the one who had survived beside her when everything else had fallen away. Together, mother and son formed something that no dynasty, no fortune, no inheritance had ever managed before, a bond built on truth, not wealth. In interviews, Anderson sometimes asked her about her childhood, her legacy, her sense of the past. She would smile faintly, her voice calm and steady, as if speaking to a distant reflection. "We're all survivors," she once told him. "We survive our names, our histories, even our own mistakes." Through the 1990s, she painted more than ever, canvases alive with color and longing. Her art became her diary, her rebellion, her prayer. Her walls were lined with images of houses, faces, oceans, each one a whisper of what she had loved and lost. Her finances, once again, were modest. The fortune had long since dispersed, the royalties from her fashion empire a thin echo of its former strength. But she no longer cared. She had come to understand what the Commodore, William Henry, Alva, and all the rest never could, that the weight of wealth is lighter when one learns to let it go. The family that had once built empires now existed in fragments. Artists, academics, quiet descendants spread across the country. The railroads were gone, the mansions sold or preserved as museums. But the name still carried a strange resonance, as though history itself refused to forget. Visitors to Biltmore still stood in awe of its vast halls, unaware that its creator's descendants lived quietly in apartments and studios. Tourists still traced the outlines of Cornelius Vanderbilt's railway terminals, his initials carved into the stone of Grand Central, not realizing that his heirs had long ceased to profit from it. Gloria, meanwhile, lived her final decades in gentleness. Her life became a portrait of contradictions, loneliness wrapped in creativity, sorrow shaped into beauty. She published memoirs that read like letters to time itself, not to preserve her name, but to make peace with it. Anderson's fame grew. He became the face of a new kind of journalism, honest, empathetic, and unflinching. People who watched him on television each night had no idea that his calm voice carried the echo of one of America's most storied legacies. He rarely spoke of it, and when he did so without reverence. To him, the Vanderbilt name was not a crown but a compass, something to learn from, not live under. As the millennium approached, Gloria's health began to wane, but her spirit remained luminous. Her home was a sanctuary of art, filled with color and conversation. She painted every day, even when her hands trembled. When visitors asked what kept her working, she smiled. "Because creation," she said, "is the opposite of despair." Outside her window, New York continued to change. The towers climbed higher, the lights grew brighter, but she had learned long ago that all structures, whether built of steel or dreams, eventually fall. What mattered was not their endurance, but the stories they left behind. In the long shadow of a dynasty that had risen from a Staten Island ferry to the heights of American wealth, she stood as its final matriarch, its artist, its witness, its soul. And as the century turned, the Vanderbilt legacy passed quietly from the age of empire to the age of empathy. No railroads, no mansions, no fortune, just a name, a story, and the people who carried it forward. The century turned quietly for the Vanderbilts, not with the thunder of railroads or the flash of Newport ballrooms, but with the soft hum of a city that no longer remembered its dynasties. Manhattan, once their kingdom, now belonged to financiers, tech visionaries, and tourists who hurried past the corners where their palaces once stood. In a light-filled apartment overlooking the Hudson River, Gloria Vanderbilt, now in her 90s, painted every day. The canvases were smaller now, her brush slower, but her eyes still burned with color. The world around her had changed in ways even her ancestors' imagination could not have grasped. The engines of fortune were digital, invisible. The new moguls built empires from code, not coal. Yet somehow, the old patterns remained: ambition, creation, collapse, rebirth. Her son, Anderson Cooper, had become one of the most trusted voices in America. On television screens across the world, his calm, steady presence carried news of war and hope, of disasters and small mercies. He had inherited his mother's empathy, his father's curiosity, and perhaps, quietly, the Commodore's endurance. But unlike his forebears, he sought no empire. He sought truth. At night, when the cameras were off, he often visited her. The two of them would sit surrounded by her paintings, their conversations drifting through time. She spoke of her youth, her losses, her loves. He listened, not as a journalist, but as a son gathering fragments of history before they faded. "You know," she told him once, her voice soft, "we're all trying to invent our lives. That's all anyone can really do." He smiled. "You did, Mom. You really did." She laughed lightly, the sound still bright even in her age. "Oh, darling," she said, "I didn't invent my life. I painted it." Her final years were marked by peace, a strange, luminous peace that had eluded every Vanderbilt before her. She no longer chased fortune, nor fame, nor even meaning. She simply existed in the present, grateful for the light through her window, the hum of the river, the stories that remained. When journalists asked about her wealth, she deflected gently. "I've been rich and I've been poor," she said once. "And believe me, rich is better. But either way, the real treasure is to be curious." In June 2019, the last great Vanderbilt of the direct line passed away at the age of 95. Anderson sat with her in her final moments, holding her hand as the light dimmed. The news of her death spread quietly, reverently, a ripple across the world. The obituaries spoke of the heiress who became an artist, the woman who outlived a dynasty. But for Anderson, and for those who truly knew her, she was more than that. She was the bridge between centuries, the last breath of an age that had begun with steamships and ended in satellites. When Anderson later spoke about her, his voice trembled with both grief and gratitude. "My mother," he said, "was the strongest person I've ever known. She never stopped seeking beauty, even when life tried to take it from her. Her ashes were scattered in the sea, near the places she had loved, between memory and sky. There were no grand mausoleums, no marble vaults with the Vanderbilt name carved in stone, just the quiet rhythm of water and time. And in that quiet, something miraculous happened. The story closed its circle. Cornelius Vanderbilt had begun with a ferry, crossing a river for a few cents a trip. 200 years later, his descendants' legacy ended at the edge of another river, in the same city, under the same light. Between them stretched the entire American story: ambition, invention, excess, loss, and reinvention. The Vanderbilt fortune was gone. The mansions were gone. The railroads were gone. But the story remained, and stories, unlike empires, do not decay. Anderson continued to tell them, on air, in print, in his own voice. In time, he would write about her, about their life together, about the strange inheritance of grief and grace that had shaped them both. His words were clear and tender. The glory of my mother's life wasn't her wealth or her name. It was her courage to keep living with an open heart. Through him, the Vanderbilt legacy found its last transformation, not as myth or monument, but as memory carried forward. The dynasty had begun with a man who measured worth in steel and ships. It ended with a woman and her son, who measured it in love and understanding. And so, the Vanderbilt story, born of ambition, tempered by loss, redeemed by art, finally found its peace. No curse, no crown, no empire, only endurance, only light. From steel to silence, from empire to art, The Vanderbilts rose, fell, and endured. Their fortune vanished, but their story became immortal, woven into the fabric of America itself. What they built in power, they redeemed in grace. Subscribe to Eternal Obsidian for more timeless stories of legacy and destiny.